Neurodivergence is a term used for someone who has ADHD, autism, Tourette syndrome, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and other conditions that are similar. Neurotypical is used to describe someone who is not neurodivergent. I guess they're typical? It's in the name. We know they're not neurodivergent. So what does neurotypical actually mean? For those of you who don't know me already, my name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialising in growing the careers and the businesses of my fellow neurospices. And this question about what neurotypical actually means has been spinning around in my brain for a while at this point. I was someone who was aware of the world of neurodivergence long before I realised that I was actually a member of that community, yet I didn't spot it in myself. And so I went a lot of my life believing that I was neurotypical. But even then, that language always felt a bit odd to me. Neurotypical. Typical implies normal, and that the opposite would be abnormal. It's a bit of an uncomfortable feature of the language. It's a term defined by what it's not. When asked to describe what neurotypical is, we have to say it's not neurodivergent, and then we have to describe what neurodivergent is. Neurotypical is just not neurodivergent. We seem to know that one, neurodivergent, in a lot more detail. If you're neurodivergent, it's because you are something or you have something. You are autistic, you are dyslexic, or you have ADHD, or you have Tourette's. I'm not really looking to go into the person first versus identity first language in this video. Person first is I have autism, identity first is I am autistic, and there's a lot of debate around that in the community. I tend to use both, mostly because I have ADHD, and so sometimes it's easier to say I think I might have autism too. But the language we use is important, and the language of describing neurotypical as not neurodivergent is relevant. Neurodivergent, in contrast, is very clearly laid out. We have all these subtypes that make up neurodivergence. We have diagnostic criteria that say this person is autistic and this person is dyslexic because they meet these sets of diagnostic rules. There are criteria laid out that define who is diagnosed and who isn't, so who gets to be part of the in-group and who is outside of it. In fact, as I discussed in my previous two videos, there's actually an overlap between neurodivergence and our personalities, and one particular study found out that they could predict whether a particular person was autistic or not with a 70% accuracy based on their personality profiles. So we can put people into groups of people who are like this versus people who are like that. As we piece together those different groups, we build up a definition of what neurodivergence actually is. What if we don't stop there? If we know that neurodivergence is highly correlated to personality and we can start putting people into these groups with a reasonable level of accuracy, why not do that for neurotypicals as well? Are there collections of people with low neuroticism, high conscientiousness, and low extroversion that we can categorise together and give them a label? Could we write out a whole diagnostic criteria like the DSM-5 to explain what this type of collection of people are like and who they are? What makes this group different from how we look at, say, the ADHD group? There are a number of questions which this whole concept brings up. For starters, what are the implications if we manage to split up the entire population into all of these different subgroups? That question is a little bit outside of my realm of expertise, but what I can dive into is it actually as simple as I'm making it out to be right now? Because as I've spent more and more time in this world, I keep coming back to one fact that I feel like is missing from most of these conversations, and that is the fact that we can't just split people into these groups distinctly. There is so much overlap between all of the different forms of neurodivergence, and we don't talk about that enough. Studies have shown that between 30 to 80% of autistic children also show symptoms of ADHD. Even if we take the lower bound of that, 30% is huge, and as we know, neurodivergence isn't just something we have in childhood and then grow out of. What this is saying is that 30% of autistic adults, at the minimum, have ADHD as well. It works the other way around. The same study found that between 20 and 50% of children with ADHD also meet the diagnostic criteria for ASD. The overlap between these two forms of neurodivergence is huge. What's even more surprising about this is that the DSM didn't actually allow you to be diagnosed with both conditions at the same time until 2013. That is only a decade ago. So we might just conclude that, okay, ADHD and autism have a huge overlap, so maybe actually we need to build 3 categories for this. So ADHD, no autism, autism, no ADHD, and then a third category, which is referred to as ADHD by those of us in the group, which is the intersection between the two groups. So we can still split everything out into these 3 nice categories, and we can partition the world of neurodivergence up, just like I described in the beginning. Not quite. 50% of children with ADHD have a comorbid tic disorder, and between 35 and 90% of children with Tourette's syndrome also present with ADHD symptoms. So now we have a massive overlap between ADHD and Tourette's. So now we need to look at ADHD, no autism, no Tourette's, Tourette's, no ADHD, autism, no ADHD, and then start looking at all the subgroups in there. It's already enough of a mouthful that I can't even explain this one here. Now, knowing of the ADHD and autism overlap, you might not be surprised to hear that between 2 and 11% of children with autism also have Tourette's. And between 3 and 20% of children with Tourette's also have autism. Another category that we need to add into our map here. Between 25 to 40% of people with dyslexia have ADHD and vice versa, which means we need to create even more categories here and more categories to map out the overlap between the existing categories. I could go on, but I think you get the point at this point. In reality, it is far more complex than just assigning people into particular subgroups. Now, I'm not here to say that these labels aren't helpful. I found my ADHD diagnosis super freeing. The self-awareness that I gained from it was really, really valuable, and I absolutely encourage people to explore these labels and see which ones fit. The fact that I potentially have autism as well, despite not having a diagnosis, doesn't negate how useful the ADHD learning has been for me. And I also don't want to imply that that means we shouldn't treat the symptoms of our neurodivergences. It is absolutely useful for me to do things to manage my ADHD, regardless of what other neurodivergences I might have. What I'm saying is we need to take more of an individual approach. Not all strategies are going to work for everyone. And I've said ever since my first video that you should try a strategy on, see if it works for you, and if it doesn't work, move on to something else. Because your individual situation is your individual uniqueness, your individual brain, and it's amazing. I also think this is a good point to talk about the increase in neurodivergence diagnoses in the last few years, of which I'm part of this wave, because this comes from an increased recognition of what neurodivergence actually is. Historically, it was thought that the autistic population was overwhelmingly male, and it was really hard as a woman to get diagnosed with autism. Now our understanding of what autistic traits look like in women has changed, and so more women are getting these diagnoses. This means that there are people like me who grew up believing that we were neurotypical, even if we had a neurodivergent sibling, only to realise much later on as an adult that our self-perception there was wrong. It also means that the line between what is neurotypical and what is neurodivergent is a moving target. It's constantly changing as our understanding and definitions of each of these forms of neurodivergence grows. So how can we define neurotypical in this context? Taking this idea to its natural conclusion, we land on the concept of neurodiversity. A bit like biodiversity, that we're all different and it's a natural part of the human experience that we all exist on a useful continuum of diversity. I read a really interesting paper on this topic. It's called Neurodiversity Studies, Mapping Out Possibilities of a New Critical Paradigm, and it was published in 2021. It looks at reframing our understanding of neurodivergence. Instead of it being these clinical definitions of ADHD, autism, and all the other forms of neurodivergence, what if there are other forms of differences that are yet to be defined? And what if neurodiversity was just a collective property of our brains? They acknowledge that neurodiversity as a term has the concept built into it that neurodiversity is natural and what is natural is always good. But this contradicts with the clinical research that is posed with the idea of alleviating suffering. But they also acknowledge that neurodiversity is a moving target and the definition evolves and changes due to cultural and societal factors. Something that we currently consider to be a significant difference between two brains might be something that we need to reconsider. Another interesting point in this paper is that historically research has been done on people who are autistic or have dyslexia, rather than with these people or by these people. This leads to making statements about those of us who are spicy-brained in our behaviours without taking into account our lived experiences. This has led to patronising questions like one I stumbled across the other day that said, "Are autistics self-aware enough to know their own personality?" Yes, I actually read this question. And if you're curious, the answer was yes. They did a study where they got parents to do a personality test for their kid and the kid to do it for themselves. And they found out that they broadly agreed just as much as the neurotypical families. But is it a question that needed to be asked? It also means that the criteria and understanding of what makes up a particular form of neurodivergence is exclusionary. And so there will be many people that have that neurodivergence that just don't fit the mold. They use the example of autistics that have an excessive interest in machinery, in technical stuff, are much more accepted in this world since the technological revolution. And while their autism may have stopped them getting job opportunities in the past, actually now they are more useful members of society and are flourishing more in these tech-style roles. This can lead to the assumption that these people aren't actually autistic because they function so well in these societies, and that means they're going to miss out on the resources that would actually be really helpful to them, and they deserve it because they are autistic. It's something that also affects me personally with my ADHD. I recently watched a webinar by adhd with Dr. William Dodson, who was talking about how the criteria for ADHD is all set out on specific behaviours that are observable. It's also not made for diagnosing and is for categorising people for research. So it doesn't include any of the things that are internal to us. I'm personally someone whose ADHD presents very internally, and the biggest problem that I struggle with ADHD is the emotional dysregulation. But emotional dysregulation isn't on the diagnostic criteria, and so it wasn't recommended that I be put on medication for it. This is despite, as Dr. Dodson describes it, medication being the best treatment for emotional dysregulation and ADHD. I'm currently unable to get the treatment that I need because the diagnostic criteria is exclusionary against me. The paper's response to this is that we neurodivergents are reclaiming the pathologizing aspects of this. We are reframing this from a position from which we can claim resources, recognition, and representation. That we should be working with neurodivergent individuals so that we can actually understand what neurodiversity looks like, so that we can remove the stigma and understand what it really means to be neurodivergent or neurotypical or just a neurodiverse group of humans. Now is a natural place for me to conclude, but there's actually something that I've been missing from this entire conversation. And that is, if we present neurodivergence as just a typical variation, part of neurodiversity, then we're missing the fact that actually some people really struggle in a really big way with their neurodivergence, and for some people it is much, much more of a challenge than it is for others. Why is some people's dyslexia disabling, when for others it's just a difference? Why can ADHD executive function problems be crippling for some people and something we just need strategies to work around for others? In order to answer these questions, we actually need to delve into different models of disability to be able to explain this a bit further. The relationship between neurodivergence, neurodiversity, and disability is one that is complex, and there's still a lot of philosophical debate about what this all means. While the paper I read doesn't discuss this specifically, it's actually based on a book which goes into it. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about in next week's video. So that's what you have to look forward to. Please like, comment, subscribe, and if you haven't seen it yet, I'd really recommend going back to watch last week's video where I talk about how much of my personality is my neurodivergence versus just me. Thank you for your attention today.